I'm so happy to be here on our sort of sad, last day of the summit. Welcome to our virtual audience and everyone here today, this morning. We're in for a real treat with our friends here from Gray Advertising. I'm not going to give too much of an introduction here, except to say, at Sozosei, we are a creative organization, hence our name. We are also a really curious organization. And so we engaged Gray because we felt curious, is there a way to change the conversation in order to decriminalize mental illness? And I'll leave you with that and turn it over. Jonathan?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm also an adopted New Yorker. I came to New York many decades ago and never left. Where's our deck?
Your deck should be coming.
The deck is coming, so we'll do a dance. Here we go. Hello. What we want to talk to you about today is about breaking blind spots. How do we actually get people to confront and see the blind spots that are preventing them from taking action, from doing things? And we have some experience in this, which we'll take you through. And we're also going to lead you in a quick conversation around our own blind spots and the blind spots in society. And then what we want to do at the end is share with you the work that we're developing that we hope will start to address some of the blind spots that we need to push to decriminalize mental illness. Yes, we are Gray. We're not all of Gray. There are a few thousand others of us out there around the world. It is a global agency. It's one of the smaller ones, 4,000 people, 32 countries. I'm Jonathan. This is Megan. This is Christine. We exist in the strategy world at Gray. We're not the creative side of things. We're the strategy side. So we're going to talk to you about the strategic stuff. We are going to share some creative work, but if you don't like it, it's okay. The creatives aren't here. We won't tell them. But we want to have a real conversation. We want to have a dialogue, and we want to really get into this with you. As was just mentioned, yes, the job we've been given is figure out how to change public opinion, or at least start that conversation. How do you trigger people to actually start thinking differently and seeing things differently so we can start to change the overarching conversation? What I want to open with is an example that we've done already for another of our clients. It's a rather large client called Procter & Gamble. They are the world's largest advertiser. They put more film and communication into the world than anyone else. And they said to us, we have a real responsibility to do that in a way that is meaningful, equitable, and authentic. And we said, yes, but the black population is not seeing themselves or their culture in any level of film, not just the advertising that you're creating. And we're helping you create, so we are complicit in this, but also the movie industry, the TV industry. And we need to do something about that. We need to find a way to actually break that. The problem was that the stories that were being told lived at the two extremes, the extreme of entertainment, excellence, sporting greatness, or jail, criminal, gang member, thug type of. And those two very thin worlds were all that was predominantly being portrayed. This ultimately was what was creating the blind spots for society at large, right? No matter who you were or where you lived, you saw the black experience in those two very thin slithers. You didn't see the broader view. And the problem didn't necessarily lie with people themselves, society themselves. They were watching what was being shown to them. The problem lay in the actual institution of film and content creation, where only 6% of writers, directors, producers in the US were black, right? So there's a fundamental issue that you can't tell a story authentically if the people who are telling that story aren't authentic themselves. It's a fundamental flaw that had to be broken. But the good news is, given that P&G spends in excess of multiple hundreds of millions of dollars a year making this content, they had a very strong card to play. They could actually drive significant change. So we set about working with them on figuring out how to actually break the systemic issues as well as the societal issues. And it's a multi-year program. We're in year 2, so they've set the goal for 5 years. So we're far from done, but we're at the beginning of the journey. And what we wanted to do was 2 things. First of all, raise cultural awareness, right? Put something out into the world that would actually trigger the conversation, that would get people thinking about this in a slightly different way. And then the other was to drive institutional change, which obviously the first side, creating some awareness, that's right in our wheelhouse, we can do that, that's what we're experts at. Driving institutional change became a whole nother challenge that we had to work very, very closely with the management team at Procter & Gamble about, because that meant changing the way they bid out work, the way we chose vendors. How did we make sure that the right people were being applied to the right spot, to the right jobs? It also meant that we had to do things. We had a very, very tough conversation with the management team, and we said, you know, part of the problem is your teams, because your teams are not reflective of other cultures, and so they're trying to sell hair care products with a white woman in a shower washing her hair twice a week, and that is the antithesis of the black experience, right? So how do you expect? You've got to change the way you think about the way you operate. So we had to have a series of in-depth, really hard work sessions with each brand and their team to get them to see what they were not seeing, so that they could then start to actually embrace it. And it's just so little steps like that was how we got through it. Ultimately, we wanted to trigger 4 actions: sparking conversations, really investing in black-owned media. So again, P&G, there's a lot of money there. They can actually invest in the production houses that are staffing correctly, that are being more diverse. Supporting the black talent and actually nurturing it up through the system, creating scholarships for students to go to film school, right? If you don't feed them into the system, they're not going to come out the system at the other end. And then creating mentorship and really nurturing talent as we go through. Now, I'm going to share with you now the film that we produced. It was one of a series of films. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we achieved. So hopefully the film will play now.
If you think you know what happens next, ask yourself why. These are the black stories we've been shown. A narrow view that limits our understanding. But there's so much more to see. The full picture of black life. Let's widen the screen so we can widen our view.
So this was how we brought the intent into the world, right? And when P&G puts its logo on something like this and puts that into the world, it's a statement of huge intent, but they have to follow up with it, right? Otherwise, it's that empty promise. My first question to you all is, how many of you were aware of that film or saw that film? A few of you did. What did you think about it when you saw it the first time?
I thought it was outstanding.
Okay.
I thought it was a very good view where you have one perception and you get another perception when you finish the movie.
Anyone else?
Is it the one with the judge, by the way, the guy who turns out to be the judge? Is that yours?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a whole series of work that we've been doing around this that's not directly related to widen the screen, but it's about changing perspective. The one thing that we heard a lot with people that saw this, particularly non-black people, was their first response was, I had no idea. I had no idea. The thought that these stories could exist really was a shock to a lot of people because it was just not being talked about and not being shown and not being seen. Where we are with this, as I said, it's an ongoing program. Through the act of creating this and the changes to the way that we are addressing vendor selection and various other things, there's 300 creators from the black community have been engaged and employed through the process. So that's a drop in the ocean, but it's a step in the right direction from where they were. We've done a lot of work. There was some TikTok work that just blew up, got over 10 billion views, and really started to expand the awareness. There's a program that's been created in the Tribeca Film Festival that is just about black storytellers and making sure that they're getting their moment, and P&G has been strongly behind that. And they, because of the success in the first 2 years, they've basically doubled down their commitment. So they've gone from $3 billion, plan to invest $3 billion in diverse-owned businesses to $5 billion over the next 7 or 8 years. So they have decided that they have to put their one thing that they have in their power, money, to work in the right way. And we're working with them on a new tool so that they can work with not just our agency, but other agencies to make sure that we are applying the right talent to the work. So the right people are telling the stories and the brand teams are operating in the right way. The reason we wanted to share this with you is because it's an example of how our blind spots exist. We are not necessarily responsible for the creation of our own blind spots. Other things are. And you have to understand what's behind the blind spot in order to begin to affect the response, right? We have to think about the trigger, not just the action, and how you get to it. And when we first got this brief, we were really excited, right? Because it's a really interesting creative project. And then we sat down and went, well, we'll create some beautiful communication, but that is going to do this much. And how do we actually engage in bigger, broader, more meaningful, substantive conversations with P&G to get them to actually change in a real way so that the industry itself changes? And it started to open up for us a ton of other hard conversations. You know, we looked at ourselves, we looked at our own industry. The average cost for someone to go to a portfolio school to learn how to create ads is fundamentally out of bounds for most people of color, right? It is something that is available to the affluent. It's, you know, $70,000, $80,000 a year, right? To go to a good art school to get. There's 3 places in the country where you go to learn this stuff, and it's expensive. So how do we break that? How do we change that? How do we hire people who haven't had that education and teach them ourselves? How do we find talent in other areas and bring it in so that we are ourselves being more reflective and more true to our diversity and inclusion goals? So It's a wonderful first step, long way to go. And I kind of view this whole conversation we're having and the work we'll show you today as that first step too. And I hope we can have a very vibrant conversation about some of these blind spots for the next 45 minutes or so. What do you think?
Yeah.
Good? Any other questions about that? I'm happy to answer any, inside advertising questions. No, we don't drink martinis every day, only on Fridays.
Is this being done through a foundation or through Procter &
It's through Procter & Gamble. It's funding it themselves. They feel very strongly about this, and it's part of their corporate responsibility programs. Yes, sir.
From that sort of combining corporate responsibility with financial, are they seeing return on this?
We are in the process of trying to work out the measurement of it, and I'll give them the credit. They're not as worried about an ROI as they are about the ROI. They're concerned about is the amount of portrayals that are correct versus the dollars that come from it. They firmly believe if they behave correctly, the money will sort itself out at the other end. Yes?
Where are the advertisements running, and how does it compare to other media that
Well,
you're running?
yeah, so that's a very, very good, that's the rub, if I'm going to be honest, because the expensive part of all of this is the media, or the more expensive part of this is the media, shall we say. And so that work ran about 2 years ago, and it runs on and off where they can get donated media. There's a lot of times they take media that they've pre-bought that they can't use, and they will use it for that. So getting into a more systematic and more fixed media plan would be a big step forward, but that's being worked on.
So just to ask a clarifying question, minor point on it. So you're saying that they're not really worried about the return on investment, but they're only going to use media space that has been donated?
They're spending some of their own money on it, but they're also getting media dollars from other places as well. Yeah. Yes. Well, that's what that says.
Was there a concern, or presumably you tested lots of ways to tell the story, that showing the typical stereotype in the first part would reinforce the stereotypes you're trying to break before the viewer got to the second part?
Yeah, there is there's a truth that we like to hold to in our business, which is assume the consumer, assume the customer actually has a brain and can actually digest the full narrative that you're putting on the table. Too often we fall into the trap of saying, oh, they're not smart enough to figure that out. But the power of engaging them through the initial stereotype, if you don't have that, you don't have the tension of the twist, and therefore you don't have the moment of revelation, right? And so it's a point of, we have to play that game delicately, and you'll notice about how long into the film did we actually flip the switch, right? You start getting hints of it relatively early, but then it really pulls through. So it's that's like saying, should we only make movies that start with the end because people aren't going to watch the whole thing through the narrative, right? We have to think about our films in the same sort of shorter time frame, but the same narrative arc.
Do we want to take questions from the online
One more?
audience as well? Yeah, I don't know if there's anyone watching remotely who has any questions they want to write in.
I don't have a question, I have more of a statement. I'm excited about what P&G is doing and thinking differently and doing differently. And as we think about, our role scope position a lot of times is we initially go to looking at what the investment is and then trying to measure outcomes in our traditional way. And it looks like P&G is thinking about this differently. And I would just, I don't know what the line will be in asking questions after the film, so I wanted to get this point out. I am excited about P&G thinking about ROI differently.
I think with these types of efforts, we have to think about ROI differently. We have to think about it in terms of cultural impact. We have to think about it in terms of conversation generated. We have to think about it in terms of, what action is taken and is it the right action, right? And so that's a very, for corporations, that's often a hard thing to do. I think it's easier for foundations because we're not selling something per se that actually has to be pulled through. But you're right, it is, and it's a hard conversation. After watching the video, I have questions from non-black people. Oh, we see we're having trouble reading it in many ways. Definitely so. It is.
Yeah.
Is this so non-black people can see black people differently, or so black people can have multi-dimensional stories told, or both? It is both. The idea here is that non-black people need to see the full aspects of black culture, and black people need to see their culture represented correctly. And it works. It's a dual-sided conversation. Thank you, anonymous person who typed and is now adjusting the font size.
I think that's
Which I love. So thoughtful. Any other comments, thoughts? Yes, at the back. Who's making them? Well, we engage with production houses. We are creating them. Our creatives are actually, doing all of the creative direction and the writing, and then we use third-party production houses. And the point is, what we've been using black-owned and people to actually engage in that, and through those companies, encouraging more and more hiring through that to make sure that the people actually creating the story, the people behind the camera, the people on set are all have the right background.
And amongst the strategists?
Yes, the strategist that worked on this no longer works at Gray, unfortunately, which is why we're talking about it. But yes, it was a strategist of color. And it was a creative team as well, so.
I don't think this is, oh my God, that's so loud. I don't think this is a question as much as it is a comment or something I'm thinking through, but what I'm noticing is that there's a parallel between what you're doing here and some of what they do in terms of reshaping the narrative about the criminal justice system. And I guess I'm wondering why we owe audiences this moment of proving humanity rather than just starting at the baseline of these are black stories. Like, why do we have to say these are tropes and now these are black stories? Like, does that make sense? Am I getting somewhere? It frustrates me, I guess, as a returned person that the baseline is always like, we have to prove that the people inside are human beings, and then we can get to their multi-dimensional aspects. And so I'm wondering, like, why this is the same and why we're not just coming from the end place instead of trying to reshape this narrative for the select few that have it.
It's a very good question. In this instance, it was a creative choice by the creatives on the project to lead with the stereotype in order to create the flip. But the point you're making is not invalid at all. Again, it comes down to how you want to use the medium to create the engagement that you need.
I think especially as we start to talk about decriminalization, I think that there is something we have to recognize is that, like, this audience is so passionate and knowledgeable and understands the complexity of the issue, sees the humanity of these people, but you're talking to a largely apathetic and unaware general public. And so for us, it's like with all of the messages they're getting, they're seeing every day, all the news they're seeing, like, how do you create that moment of emotion, of attention, and how do you get them to talk a little differently. And sometimes that is about like priming their own stereotype and then breaking it for them so that they can have that moment of realization and they can care and they can lean in, because otherwise, like, unfortunately, a lot of things people can care about a lot of different things throughout their day, and like, how do we get them to pay attention to this, support this, behave differently when it comes to this?
Yeah, that's a great comment. It's the unfortunate reality is that, you know, we know that this is how our society sees Black life. It shouldn't be the case. And to some degree, there is definitely, we all have a responsibility to, you know, inform ourselves, to educate ourselves, and to try to be better. But, you know, if our goal is to change society, we unfortunately have to be realistic about, you know, the limitations that are currently out there, and the you know, the narrow thinking that's currently out there. And yeah, so this is also the case with mental illness. There's so many blind spots. There's certainly a lot of responsibility on individuals within our society to try to examine our own biases, our own stereotypes. But the unfortunate reality is that society is treating mental illness in a certain way that's pervasive, that's around us. It's not necessarily our fault that that's what we've always been exposed to and then therefore internalize and believe. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the blind spots that are impacting our view of mental illness. And so we'll just kind of go through a few that, you know, these are topics that have been coming up throughout, you know, the various sessions at this summit. Obviously, this is something that's part of a bit of a cultural narrative that is kind of out there already. People are talking about these a little bit organically. But, you know, so the first one here, this one is unfortunately really, really prevalent. So, you know, whenever there's any gun violence, whenever there's, you know, the latest school shooting, which unfortunately happens far too often, you know, there's immediately discussion around mental illness. And so, you know, we saw with the school shooting in Texas that the Texas government's response was, we're going to redouble down on mental health services, even though the gunman had, you know, no known mental health history. But this is all just part of that narrative that mental illness equals violence, that people with mental illness are inherently violent, that they're a danger to themselves and to others. Even though, as you know, as we in this room know, people with mental illness are more likely to be the victims of violence than to perpetrate it. But there's this very prevalent narrative that this is a huge cultural blind spot. Kind of conversely, on the other side, way on the other side of the spectrum, we also see a lot of trivialization of mental illness. So people saying like, oh, this is all, you know, it's a choice. Just, you know, try to free yourself. Try to be more, think more positively. Or saying things like, oh, that's not really, you know, bipolar. That's just teenagers are hormonal. That's just, you know, why are we labeling it something? Or even kind of counterintuitively, that the converse of that is that sometimes mental illness is glorified, and we say, okay, so people who are, you know, the ones who are crazy enough to think differently, they change the world. We have, especially, you know, we're here in, you know, in art school, in art museums. There's this narrative of the tortured genius, somebody who's mentally ill, and they channel that into their art, and that's good and that's beautiful. And but all of this, what it really boils down to is this belief that mental illness isn't real illness. It's not really, you know, it's all in your head, which of course it is. That's where the brain is. Had that conversation with somebody recently. But, you know, there's this pervasive belief that it's just fundamentally different than other medical illnesses. And the final one that we want to talk about is access and equity. And so, again, we in this room know that there's horrible access issues, that so many people with mental illness do not have access to healthcare. Of course, that is very much exacerbated by other systemic issues. People who are marginalized in other ways have even greater difficulty getting access to mental health care. But even still, there's a blind spot around this in our society that has actually sometimes been called the Shirley principle, where the idea is that we don't really need to legislate based on this. We don't really need to make any fundamental change, because surely there's a way for people to get help if they really need it, if they really want it. This is something that we talk about with unhoused people, is that, oh, well, there's all sorts of resources for that. They're just not seeking it out. They're choosing to stay on the street. You know, there's if they really wanted to, they could get help, and they're choosing not to. This is a massive blind spot. You know, this is not the case. Access is a massive issue. So, you know, again, this is just these are three that we've identified, but obviously just over the course of this summit, there have been lots of blind spots that we've talked about, but we now want to open this conversation up and just say, okay, so what else? What else? If anybody has comments on, to build on, the three that we've already just discussed, or if there's any that you'd like to add, you think we should talk about, yeah. And then, if you could just let us know your name and who you are.
Yeah, my name is Mark Pumper. I'm here in an independent capacity. My child has got a serious mental illness, and we've been coping with it for the past 15 years or so. So I would just bring up the burden on caregivers as something that is not brought up a lot, and that, as you think about Alzheimer's or something like that, puts tremendous strains on families and having to care for a loved one for 5-10 years. But someone with serious mental illness can be 30-40-year sentence, and it doesn't go away, and it also carries with it a ton of stigma. People become isolated because they can't fit in easily socially. There's a lot of disruption that goes on. And I'd also just add one more wrinkle to that. I see it as a women's rights issue, because at the end of the day, the caregivers wind up largely being the mothers.
Yeah, very interesting.
So for you in that, do you feel that at societal level we have a blind spot that we're not paying attention to the caregiver?
Yeah, very much so. I think that sort of gets lost in the sauce. We focus on the person who seems crazy, but or whatever, however you want to characterize it. But the caregivers, the strain on the families, and even siblings and what have you. There's a lot of damage, and I guess it's understood if you think of an alcoholic kind of context. People have kind of gotten that message, but there's similar kind of trauma that families go through in light of someone with serious mental illness.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, that mental illness doesn't just affect the person who has the illness themselves. Yeah, and then the back right here.
Chris Bullard with Sound Mind Live. I just wanted to go back to the point that you were talking about beginning a narrative with something that's going to capture attention. I would just encourage everyone to think about what the potential impacts of that could be. I think, as someone who lives with bipolar disorder, I see often people reinforcing this image of, we need to get rid of the stigma, or we need to not think about people like this. And as you're saying that, in that moment, you're actually reinforcing for someone else that the world is thinking this way and we need to change that. And that's reinforcing a shame within them. And to me, it's a very similar way of how a lot of times when you would see starving children in Africa on TV,
right.
and it kind of reinforces this colonial narrative around we need to go be the savior abroad. And it's well-intentioned to capture attention, to get dollars put there, but I think the longer-term societal cultural impacts around narrative and the way we use language is super important. So I would just encourage a lot of thoughtfulness around that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And is that the kind of thing that you believe, like the work with Widen the Screen, where it's so important that we have people of color being involved in every stage of the process in developing this messaging? Is that, do you think, a similar solution would be part of people with lived experience with mental illness being part of every aspect of this, so that they're making sure that the language is accurate, is empathetic, is the portrayal of their own lived experience is accurate? Would you?
Yeah, definitely. And to that point, we were talking about, someone asked who was on the team that did this, and I think not just asking those people, what they think, but ones who it is their full-time job to be thinking about communications deeply. And this is a longer-term thing, but having equal opportunity for folks in different backgrounds, as well as people living with mental health issues on those teams in the long term, and just not thinking about what we can do now, but how do you bring more of those people in the long term, which obviously it's not something you can do in a 1 or 2 year project, but I think it can make little strides down.
Just before, I'd like to also remind everybody who's watching online just to please feel free to jump in with questions as well.
So, in a similar way that you have your lovely flip, we often don't see functional mental illness. We don't see individuals who are succeeding and thriving, and we don't see the judges and the doctors and the nurses and the cops and the folks that are on all sides of the equation also dealing, whether they're struggling or thriving. We just don't see that. It's, again, a very compartmentalized, that if you have mental illness, you are in this category, on the street, in this, I think that's a real shame. It doesn't give people the idea that, boy, so many people are managing mental illness successfully. Like, that you can, and you will, and you're not alone, and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful comment. And this is something that Dr. Carson and the Gray team have talked about a lot, is that, when parents see their child break their leg, obviously it's terrible. You don't want to see your child suffering, but you know there's hope. You know there's care available. There's a treatment process for this. You roughly know what's going to happen, and you know that your kid's going to be okay. You know that the broken leg will heal. Mental illness is not treated the same way. When a parent gets a diagnosis for their child, they're devastated. They don't have that hope that their child will become, will be successful, will be a doctor or a judge or whatever, because that's not the narrative. So I think that's a wonderful point, is that we show that full spectrum of how treatment does exist, it is available, and people live very, very happy and successful lives.
So my name's Andy Keller with the Meadows Institute. I think one of the blind spots I would want us to look at, and I want to tell you what it is, and I want to tell you the two lenses I have on it, is that we think that these are adult illnesses that begin in a moment of crisis. When in reality, these are pediatric illnesses that begin, so one lens I have on this is someone who's lived with an anxiety disorder my whole life. If you look at the little kid movies of me at age 3, it's very clear that there's something different going on there. Prevalence of anxiety disorders, 50% are in place by the time you're age 5. And when we look at people, for example, who have more severe mental illnesses like psychosis, we'll talk about sort of what was the early stages of psychosis, but there's really good research that shows if you go back 10 or 15 years before that, they had anxiety disorders. And they had other types of lesser illnesses, much like earlier stages of cancer, much like my heart disease risk. So that's one lens on that. But I think the other lens is, we're based in Texas, so we were in the middle of this whole Uvalde school horror, which I think is the only word I've been able to settle on with that, which was very much politicized around violence, mental illness, and people focused on, they call this, the young man who did that a shooter, focused on the violence, focused on this very superficial discussion about whether there could have been a treatment around that, as opposed to rolling things back 2 years when he walked into school with cuts all over his face in a very typical expression of adolescent depression, or roll back 10 years when he was a young, troubled man, probably with some level of trauma-induced disorder, and a mom who herself struggled with addiction. So I think part of it is rolling the screen back to where did these things begin, as opposed to saying these are illnesses that are totally defined by that moment of crisis, which is very visible to the public.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. Just like with cancer, earlier intervention means that you never get to that point. Maybe you can prevent that point of crisis from ever happening if you intervene earlier.
So I think it's also important to kind of understand that for people that do avoid services, that they may have some access, that sometimes there's reasons besides lack of awareness or insight. It could be because they've had bad experiences with the mental health system previously, because we have some really good services out there, and it's great when you have access to choice in services, but a lot of people don't. So if they get time with a prescriber, it can be very limited, so they don't have the time to really work through what might work in terms of medication, and they may not have access to other types of support. So just because someone may not be willing to engage in what's been offered doesn't mean, we also need to look at what are we offering to people to make sure that we're looking at it. The other thing I think it has to be part of this is thinking about intersectionality. So we know that people of color are treated differently by all of the systems that they touch, and really thinking about that as well. We have a lot of people, I've spent some time looking for movie representations of mental illness, and it was really hard to find some really good ones of people of color experiencing mental illness, but there's various other things with white people. So just kind of what we're exposed to. Oftentimes it could be a violent person of color with mental illness, and then you have a white person who may be experiencing depression and anxiety, and we know that you can be white and have experienced psychosis. You can be a person of color and experience depression and anxiety. So really thinking through that intersectional piece.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's not intersectional, then it's not accurate. And I mean, we all know that the criminalization of mental illness disproportionately affects people of color. You know, if there's somebody experiencing crisis in public and they're white and they get the cops called on them, there's a lot more likelihood that the cops will de-escalate, as opposed to a person of color experiencing crisis in public and, you know, things might escalate and God forbid they might be shot. And this is just the reality of it. So absolutely, that's the intersectional view is necessary and fundamental.
Hi, I'm Sarah Johnson with the Joy Labs, and I am digging this conversation. Oh, my people. The couple of thoughts that I have when I think about this is, so thinking about, we want to show the behavior we want. So if we're building community of care, if we're building a culture of mental health, instead of saying to a child who's running down the hallway, don't run, we say, walk please. So how are we illuminating the behaviors that we want and really minimizing the behaviors we don't want? Which is one of the reasons why I really like to, instead of talking about stigma, I like to focus on normalizing. And I heard a couple of people say that. How do we normalize conversations about mental health? How do we normalize not only help seeking, but help giving? So if we want a community of care, we all have a role in that. So it's not just putting the burden on the person who's struggling. If I'm struggling, yes, it's an important skill for me to ask for help. I also want to know I have a role as an informal support, and everyone at the grocery store, everyone at the mall, everyone in the room has a role in supporting mental health and help giving.
That's right. Other side.
Hello, my name is Oyewumi Oyeni. I'm a senior reporter with YMG. And I think a really big blind spot that I've been seeing in school and in the world recently is people expecting people who have mental disabilities or mental illness to just function as mentally stable people once they have treatment. And I think you have to understand, if somebody has a mental illness or mental disability, they have that their entire life. It's not going away. It is part of who they are. And so we need to start focusing more on equity and less on trying to make people assimilate into the provocative culture, the real culture, the majority culture. Because even in minority communities, you can be misdiagnosed as mentally ill because your culture is different. And so also recognizing differently abled does mean differently abled. There are things that somebody with anxiety can do that I can't do because of their disability, because of their disorder. And so I feel like reframing society. Because if the world was built for people with anxiety, we would be the mentally ill ones. And so I feel like focusing on taking those steps to working with them and building a world that works best for them instead of just focusing on treatment. Because there's nothing wrong with them. There's something wrong with the world that made them like this or that it doesn't function right for them.
That's right.
It's important to remember.
Thank you.
That's a really important point, and I think it's very, very similar to the point that was just made about normalizing and about you know, seeing the humanity, not just breaking down the stigma, but building back a more, you know, accepting, empathetic view of people with mental illness. And it is you know, it is a tricky balancing act between acknowledging that the reality that mental illness is illness, and it's not it's a bad thing, and people are suffering, and we want to alleviate suffering. At the same time, we shouldn't, you know, we don't want to demonize these people. We don't want to say this is something that is fundamentally wrong with you as a person. They're human, and this is something that we talk about a lot, you know, internally at Gray with Sozosei, and then at the summit as well. Is that's how other physical illnesses are treated, and that's not how mental illness is treated. You would never look at somebody with cancer and think, oh, they brought this on themselves. This is their upbringing, or they're fundamentally a bad person. You know, they're treated with empathy, and they're accepted, and you acknowledge that, of course, this is not a good thing. They are suffering. We want to alleviate that suffering, but again, that doesn't completely define them. And so it's important to, again, we talk a lot about the decriminalization of mental illness. We also talk about the remedicalization of mental illness, that it is a medical condition like other medical conditions are, and people deserve the same treatment and empathy as patients with other medical conditions.
In the back.
Great, thank you. Susan Shaw with Trinity Church, Wall Street. Just building on the last comment, you know, I think in addition to, you mentioned schools, you know, just the way that dominant institutions like our places of work are not actually accommodating and acknowledging the fact that many of their employees, you know, staff have SMI or, mental health issues. And then what that does in terms of then feeding the criminalization, like the impact of these like dominant institutions isolating, alienating, individuals, and then how that pushes. And then just one more thing related to the normalization of this. I do think that as a parent of a teenager, that teens are talking about mental health and mental illness at super high rates, and it's just a different conversation. So I think that's something that I think we all can learn from and need to acknowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah, we as a society are talking about mental illness and mental health more broadly more than ever, and a lot of that is driven by the younger generations, which is a wonderful thing. Yeah.
Good morning, Raul Andrews, APA Foundation. I think one of the things you're missing is what's happening in this room, right? If people don't tell you what they're dealing with, you just see them as human beings. And only when they divulge do you know something different. So at the cornerstone of behavioral change, typically it's cost, comfort, and connectivity. So I think you need to look at your paradigms and what is the cost issue that might be driving? What is the connectivity or comfort issue? Because at the end of the day, awareness is high as it's ever been. It's not going to stay here forever, but it's as high as it's ever been. The unmet need is exponentially higher than the awareness. So it's not just about doing awareness. And for my friends who want to normalize this, we have already done some testing at the APA Foundation, and those in community say, what's wrong with me that I need to be normalized? What APA Foundation is going to be doing is making this a mainstream priority. So we're using the term mainstream, and what we're saying is there's no difference between your diabetes and your depression.
Yeah.
Right? That's how we're going to do it. Thank you.
So this is we'll keep getting, first of all, thank you. These are conversations we've been having with our friends for the last 6 to 9 months. And I think the reason we wanted to bring it up is there are a lot of blind spots, a lot. And they come from all different sides of the problem, right? And everybody has their own personal experience. My lived experiences, I have a now 21-year-old who was diagnosed with depression when she was a teenager. And it was a horrible, horrible experience for me as a parent to be able to not know what to do, to have my teenager say, Dad, you can use the word, it's okay, right? It's heart-wrenching, it's gut-wrenching, not knowing. So we've all have our own personal bias that gets attached to this as well, right? Because of our own experience. The one thing I want you all to sort of take away from this is none of you are wrong. None of you are wrong. But what we have to do when we think about communications and bringing things into the world that will trigger conversation or spark changes, we have to make a choice. We have to find the thing that's going to be the most impactful, the thing that we think is going to get this type of conversation happening in any form or shape that we can get it to happen in, right? We can't predict it will be this one or this one or this one, but we can do something that will get everybody to go, ooh, and will we break some eggs along the way? Probably, but that's where we will have to do that. We can't balance, and in the minute that we try to acquiesce or balance to different perspectives, we end up with something that's not as powerful, right? So keep that in mind as you're thinking about your own personal actions, right? Don't try to do everything. Try to address 1 or 2 biases, and you'll have much, much more impact eventually, because it's the fight that wins the overall battle, right? The little fights that win the battle.
Hi,
Yes?
Rebecca Newstetter at the University of Chicago Health Lab. So I look around this room and I just see so much brilliance in the development of ideas and programs. And what I think is really missing in this space is an investment in implementation. And so it takes me back to the example that you shared with us of the video. And thank you all for sharing such personal stories and for sharing your work at Gray. I think it's really important. But I'm a little bit hung up on like Procter & Gamble, and they have so much money and frankly have harmed Black communities and poor communities in some really tangible ways. And the fact that they have not invested in implementing this media campaign in a real meaningful way is emblematic to me of the investment that we make in ideas and how little then we invest in implementation of those ideas in the field. And that really feels sort of just missing and absent and is the greatest blind spot in my perspective.
Okay. I would like to push back a little bit on that, in the sense that the P&G acknowledging that they have a problem, that P&G acknowledging that they have been and are instigators of the problem, is a very, very big step for an organization of that size. They are working very hard. Their investment today is on their internal change, and they are investing an awful lot of money to change the way that they operate and the way that they function, so that they can change, so that the work that they put out into the world is actually correct, right? So whilst it's not a classic media buy investment, they are actually making a huge investment into this. So I just want to be, I want to be clear, and to get an organization of that size to do anything is a step, in my mind, in the right direction. So, and by them driving that change, the other investments will come. And that's the way that they view it. As it's a 3 to 5 year program, and I fully expect by the end of the 5 years we'll have a full, there will be a much more robust media investment.
Sorry, yeah, and not to just pick on
No.
P&G here, like it's a broader statement, but in maybe a return on investment question be the next time that you show that video that there's more than like 4 people in the audience that have seen it.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Angela Kimball, Inseparable. And so I just want to thank you for this provocative conversation. I want to pivot back to some of the blind spots. So when I think about how the conversation is changing throughout our country around mental illness, I'm also struck by the fact that so many people accept things that we have in society that are emblematic of systemic discrimination. We have entire health plans, Medicare, that does not offer parity coverage of mental illness. And frankly, how many Americans really realize that? That a marriage and family therapist isn't covered by Medicare. And it gets more insidious than that. How many people have applied for a professional license, or in my case, even a driver's license, and had a question about whether or not you live with a mental illness asked of you? And that is subtly sending a message that you're unworthy if you have a mental illness. Then there are only 2 groups of people who are never questioned about their experience of care as a required element leaving a hospital inpatient, stay. People with mental health conditions as a primary diagnosis, people with a substance use as a primary diagnosis. That's discriminatory. And what we've learned is it's only because they never bothered to test the experience of care survey on people with mental health or substance use conditions. And finally, there are people who cannot vote because they've had a psychiatric hospitalization. There are so many examples of sort of these subtle discriminations embodied in our society that I think perpetuate this idea of criminalization, of unworthiness, of less than, and we even use language that others people who live with mental health conditions. So I don't have answers, but I'm intrigued by this conversation. And how do we change that dialogue?
Yes.
Absolutely.
So I want to pivot at this point because you actually brought up a very, you've given me a very natural transition into the next part of our conversation. We'll take this, if you want to speak up, yeah, and then I want to come back because I want to pivot a little bit.
It just dawned on me there's another major blind spot that really doesn't get spoken about, and it's kind of obvious, but the real lack of capacity across the entire value stream of care. There's a lack of housing at the end when people with serious mental illness come out. There's a lack of beds in hospitals, which is a fraction of 20th of what it used to be. And there's a lack of kind of humane treatment. If you go to psychiatric facilities these days, they're overcrowded, they're well understaffed, they're not the best and the brightest people providing the care, and what you wind up with is really a very, very harsh system that doesn't get any kind of scrutiny. My son was in a facility during COVID for almost a year. He was not allowed once to go outdoors. In jails, they would be outdoors every day. So the treatment that people are receiving is hidden and is really awful.
Yep.
So the kind of exposés you've had on jails are really needed within the psychiatric systems today, and the change should be one towards more humanity rather than just such harsh treatment.
Yep, I agree. So, not to cut off what is obviously a vibrant conversation, but they're telling us we have to move to our next segment now. So the people in control in the back are informing us. So the timing was right. What we would like to do now is, before we get into some of the work we've been doing, is we want you to sort of look in at yourselves a little bit. We've been talking about blind spots in society. I want you to take a hard look inside yourself now and ask yourself about the blind spots that you have yourself as it relates to this. And let's talk about that a little bit, because oftentimes we lose sight of the things that are actually creating blinkers for ourselves, and so we don't actually open ourselves up to see what everybody else is seeing and thinking and feeling. So I'll throw that bomb at you and see what you throw back at us.
I can actually start, and I
for it.
think one of the a couple people have made this point a little bit about almost being open, almost coming out as mentally ill, or being, you know, and that being a powerful way to normalize that to the people around you. And, you know, society kind of treats it as if you have mental illness but you are functioning, you're high functioning, then you kind of keep that part of yourself hidden, again, to avoid the stigmas, to avoid people thinking you're lesser than. Or to avoid, instead of being a force for saying, you know, no, I am somebody with mental illness. And so that's actually something that I was originally brought onto the project, onto this project, Sozosei, because I'm a behavioral scientist by training. And so I'm very, you know, I have my PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and now I work at Gray. And so I was brought on to talk about behavior and psychology. And what my colleagues didn't know is that I do have mental illness, and I have been hospitalized in the past. And that's something that, I don't think Jonathan knows. And I've never mentioned that before because I didn't want, you know, people to think about me differently, because I am my condition is extremely well managed. I'm in therapy, I'm medicated, and it was a grueling trial and error to get something that works for me, and it works incredibly well. And my life is, I consider myself a success story. And so that's one of my blind spots, though, is that I don't talk about that. I consider that in my past, and I consider that irrelevant to my current job, my professional life, that I just should keep that hidden and only speak as a expert PhD behavioral scientist and not as someone with lived experience. So I'll just throw that out there as, I think, one of my blind spots.
Thank you. My personal blind spot was when my daughter was diagnosed. I didn't believe depression was a real disease. And she would tell me, it's not like you just waking up and having a bad day, Dad. And I couldn't get my head around that. I couldn't get my head around the idea that there was this thing, this disease that she had that was anxiety driven, to the example that was brought up earlier, as a teenager, triggered by anxiety. And I refused to accept it. And it almost got to the point where that actually interfered with her getting treatment, which was even more guilt on my part, but we got through it. But yeah, so come on, we've shared.
I know it's so easy to talk about society's blind spots and point the finger. It's a lot harder.
So somebody brought up how teenagers are really talking a lot about mental health. And so as a parent who often minimizes my children's everything, I look at that in social media and how prevalent there's a lot of glorification of some serious disorders. Thank you. So I forgot to introduce myself earlier. My name is Erica Harding, and I'm with the CSHZ team that you heard speak yesterday, and I'm with Amplify Consulting. But I think many of us who are parents are sometimes dismissive of what's going down with our kids.
Yes.
So I look at social media, I look at some of the glorification of some very serious things, some really, really intense things. And that makes me think there is it's awful to say, that it's a faking. Oh, it's going to be cool if I take on this distressing disorder, and therefore I think, it's not real.
It's a social currency now for that generation, almost, it feels like to people.
Almost. And I acknowledge that, therefore, it makes it really easy for like middle-aged me to go, get over it.
Yeah.
I acknowledge the reality of tremendous mental health issues of my own child. But I also look at that and go, right?
That's right.
We had some provocations as well to help break this, or discussion, but one of them we wanted to know is, like, we've talked a lot about lived experience this over the course of the 3 days. Do some lived experiences matter more than others?
There you go. Is my lived experience more or less valuable than someone else's lived experience?
I think that's a really critical one, especially if you have an anxiety disorder, because you're like, you live your life thinking, well, this isn't that big a deal. I mean, that's what you tell yourself actually to cope if you have an anxiety disorder. So I thought about it, and your two experiences made me think about one thing that I don't think about as much, but I need to more, is that these are multi-generational as well. So like, Jonathan, your point about how you discovered with your daughter, like, so one of my family members, when they came out with their depression and my inability to really see that as a psychologist, right? You would think as a psychologist. If you're a psychologist, you're really good at being able to pretend like it's something else, actually, because you have this whole lexicon. And then being able to see through talking to them about my own, being able to talk more about my own anxiety. And I think that's a hard thing, because we can't really help people understand that these are illnesses if we don't believe it ourselves. And I think that's why I make myself talk about the anxiety, because what I'm really telling myself is it's not that big a deal, when in reality we have to talk about it that way.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I'm not sure that this is so much a blind spot as a misconception that I had, but I used to think that if we talked about mental illness through a biomedical framework, it would contribute to destigmatizing it. And then upon, familiarizing myself with more of the empirical research in this area, specifically work by Pat Corrigan and colleagues, I realized that actually the opposite is true, and that when we present mental illness as having a biological basis, it has the latent effect of reinforcing stigmatizing views. So I think that's also something to consider as we move forward in trying to change cultural narratives, that we potentially may not want to take a biological framework in doing so.
That's a very interesting insight. I'd actually love if you could tell us a little bit more about that, because, as we've mentioned, that in some ways we think one of the solutions is, well, why don't we treat mental illness the same way we treat other illness? Because people with other physical illnesses get more empathy. They're seen as, patients, not as, somebody who's either, they're just being a diva, or they're, there's something like they're a deviant is the other word we use a lot, that there's something wrong with them. So is it that it reinforces that kind of stereotype, that there's something physically wrong, fundamentally wrong with somebody they're beyond treatment? Or do they, in this research, do they speak to why that reinforces stigma instead of removing it?
Yeah, the study that I'm speaking about or thinking of specifically is an experiment where people were presented with vignettes of people with mental illnesses, one of which was characterized as having a biological basis and the other was not. And then the responses from participants in the study were more stigmatizing towards the person in the case presented with the biological basis. So through that kind of a study, you can establish the mechanisms through which, like the thought process.
Right.
However, I believe the interpretation was exactly what you indicated, that it cites the problem as inherent within the individual and intrinsic and potentially, immutable, versus having also social components.
Yeah.
I think that is fascinating when we think about the need to medicalize the illness at the same time, and that's basically saying, no, we shouldn't, or should we, or still lots of unanswered questions, I guess.
I was a student of Pat Corrigan's on that study, so
Oh, wow.
just a little bit additional. My name's Amy Watson. I'm from University of Wisconsin. But what we found was there's different dimensions to stigma. So a biomedical explanation can reduce blame. So it's not your fault. However, you're more other. Like there's something wrong with your brain, you might be more dangerous. So people actually perceive more danger with someone if there was a biological explanation, because you're more different from me.
Right.
And
Because they
more
don't understand the
unpredictability.
biological implication.
Yeah, right, and it's more of a permanent type of thing.
Yeah.
So that's where that variation was, and there's been other studies that have come up with the same findings, so it's not a single study finding. So really thinking about a more balanced perspective and also using contact type interventions where someone gets to know someone with mental illness as a whole person, not just as, sort of that brain disease explanation, actually really others people more than a more psychosocial type of explanation.
I think wow.
Loud.
It's like funkadelic. I was one of the my blind spot. I've worked in this field 45 years, and but it's and other people have commented the same. And it's like, how do you admit your own struggle with things, right? And so, because this gets to sort of how you can use advertising, can use campaigns to help people gain enough. Not just insight, but strength to acknowledge there. And I work with Andy and for Andy, and we've had this campaign. It's okay to say that you have a mental illness. And during COVID, whatever, struggled like a lot of folks. And my wife was like, "You got to get help," and I'm like, "No, I don't, because I'm strong." And it took a long time to finally talk to Andy, not just as a boss, but as a friend, because to talk to him as a boss is acknowledging weakness, even in a company devoted to mental illness. To talk to him as a friend, and so actually Andy helped arrange for me to get some help I needed. And it's just that kind of, and it's ironic in a sense to work in this field for decades and still be reticent, because I can force my way through it in a sense. And again, it just taught me or reinforced for me that all the beliefs I have about resilience, strength-based approach to care and everything, when it comes to your own life, you have your own kind of self-image both to project and to protect. And it's difficult to acknowledge that, because you're afraid, if I acknowledge the crack in that self-image, then it says something more about self, sort of who you identify or how you identify yourself. So I think I had the good fortune of having a wife who stuck with me, and then a good friend and boss who really helped put me over the edge. But it took me, I would have been, the ironic thing is you're more effective if you can acknowledge the issue, but you're trying to protect your image of effectiveness by not acknowledging it. It's a weird kind of deal. So.
It's interesting that this group, we've heard so many people minimize their own struggles, and then it's like, no matter how learned you are, no matter what you do for logically, you've spent the time working on this, but then you still default to these biases you've been steeped in our society. And that's kind of, we're going to be talking to people who haven't done this work every day, who are just defaulting to those biases and those deeply held, subconscious almost opinions about what it means to them.
I don't know who's next. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention.
I believe this mic, yes.
My name's Carla Shepard-Rubinger, and I'm a publisher of 100 peer-reviewed journals in health and medicine. And one of my big issues is, how do we better educate professionals and providers in many, many disciplines? One concept that hasn't come up here, which we come up with a lot in dealing with providers, is unconscious bias. It's very prevalent, and it obviously is something we will have to deal with on a big range of issues. But I want to talk about how can we better educate providers in many, many areas: health, justice, education systems, legal systems, correctional institutions, a whole range of areas that have professionals that need education, and then the pipeline for those professionals. And I agree what P&G has done is a drop in the bucket, but they've done it. And if everybody had done it, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I do applaud what P&G is doing. I hope 5 years from now, when we're looking at this, A, there's been some success, and B, they're still doing it. It's not going to be done in 5 years, even with $5 billion.
You've
So
just
the
made.
role that an organization like P&G can play in its area of influence is hugely important. And the intersectionality of training people in advertising, in education, in the legal system, in the justice system, in the healthcare system, all of them. And they all must be done, and they all must be addressed, and they all would be great if they all could hear the conversations in this room.
Yes.
But on many, many points of entry, this has to be addressed, and it's not a one-shot deal.
Well, the reason that sorry for interrupting, but you just made me realize something. I manage a team of, I think it's about, probably around the world, about 500-600 people. I have HR training on every single topic you can imagine. I have not been trained on how to address when one of my team members admits to having tells me about their mental illness, right? That is something I can change. I can go back to the office tomorrow and make that change.
Exactly. And
Right?
another team of professionals who does a pretty good job but can do better is Johnny Taylor, who's the head of SHRM, which is the HR professional organization. He does lots of ads on TV, which is why I know him. He's a minority. He's terrific. That organization is really influential because of all their members in HR. And just like you're saying, on the HR side, you haven't dealt with this. Well, there are thousands of HR professionals around the world that need to be educated
That's
about
right.
how to deal with this.
That's right. Thank you. We'll go to this side next.
Hi, Joy Acosta, Rand Corporation. You actually stole a part of my thunder because I was going to say certainly for a blind spot in the room, it could be provider bias or any institution that's dealing with individuals with mental illness and their own bias. Even if they are there to help and serve, if people have a bad experience, they won't go back to care. The other thing I wanted to raise was just as the research and evaluation, that's my area of expertise, is that there's bias in the data, so that we just really don't even, I think, understand the scope and scale of this issue. And as people were talking about normalization, it really feels like there's, when we talk about trying to prevent adolescents from substance abuse, we talk about countering their norms that everyone out there, the other people are drinking. In fact, many adolescents aren't drinking, and if you tell kids that, they're less likely to drink. And it feels like there's a normalization here about, like, we don't understand the scope and scale. But if we did, maybe telling people that, hey, there's not, I don't know what you think normal is, but there's not a normal out there. And we're here are all on a continuum, and we're here, as human beings. And this is kind of, there's not a normal-ish in anyone. So I think that's one of the blind spots too, is just, we don't know what we don't know. And it's also very hard to document impact from some of these efforts because, without the data and without the people in the, being represented in the data sources, we won't be able to document our impact.
That's a very good point. We have time for a couple more.
Hi, Rob Waters from Mindsight News. I'm really just blown away by this conversation. It's really thoughtful, thought-provoking, and I'm thinking about our blind spots and also our biases and how we constantly need to be challenging them ourselves. So, I mean, in my case, I think about, I did a lot of reporting early on in my career about over-medicalization and the dangers of over-institutionalization, over-medicalization. And then when my son was dealing with ADHD kinds of issues, I was very reluctant to have him medicated. And then I said, okay, let's try it, and kind of flipped. And then it actually didn't really work that well. It didn't really help him that much in his case. And so you're constantly going back and forth and examining your own blind spots and biases. And I'm thinking also about this issue of violence and mental illness. And, after the Q Club shooting in Denver, we came out with, a very strong statement about, that racism and homophobia are not mental illnesses. But and that is true on one level, and then on another level, if you roll the script back and look at that shooter, I'm sure you're going to find trauma in their life. And so I guess what it makes me think about, and then there's this, the debate, the endless debate about biological versus environmental causes of mental illness. And I guess what comes to me is the idea that mental health is, we just have to keep remembering that mental health exists on a spectrum, and that it's, when we say yes, mental illness, we should call it by its name, mental illness, like we would, a physical illness. But the brain is infinitely more complex than the bones of the body. And so we have to remember this spectrum, and the labels get so dangerous and so fraught. And
Yes.
I don't know how you represent all this in my challenge and your challenge, since we're in media, is how to represent this complexity. And it's tricky.
I go back to the point that I made earlier, is we can't address them all with one thing. We have to take them off one by one. But it's complicated.
It's a perfect segue from Rob, because I too am a journalist. Jane O'Donnell, I'm the founder of Youthcast Media Group. So I've been a journalist for 40 years. It can be difficult, and it's something, it's been a blind spot, but I think I've gotten past it, because I myself wrote about that I had been I don't even talk about still being in recovery, but I quit drinking 30 years ago. So people thought I was incredibly brave, because I wrote about it in USA Today. By the way, 1 million people read it. It was really well read, but it helps so many people. So it can be difficult as a journalist to strike the balance between something we struggle with all the time, is striking the balance between, I know all the people that came to me and said, it made such a difference in my life that you did that, and I really thought differently about my drinking. And similarly, I wrote about that I was in a domestic violent marriage many, many years ago. And they're like, oh, I'm so glad you talked about that. So kind of two blind spots I just wanted to bring up. One is that, you have to struggle with, you need real people, we call them, in stories. And one problem is that, I go through all the things in my head. It is important to share. People need to see people who look like them. But what is it going to be the experience for that other person? I know what the media is like. They may not. And there's also, when you're teaching, we primarily work with young people of color. And one of the things I learned a couple of years ago, and it just I thought I'd share it because it was just such an aha moment, as Oprah would say, because we were teaching, almost all Black, maybe one Hispanic student, and we were showing our real people, of course, in a class about health disparities, were Black. And the teacher said later, actually, we think it would have helped if you found poor white people. There aren't hardly any to find in Washington because it's so freaking expensive, but like that. So that's something like how and when to show people of color or not of color who have these lived experiences. And just one final thing I want to mention is one or both of the students mentioned last night, and it's so interesting the way you folks are sharing today. I too have anxiety, by the way, but that you folks have shared and others in the audience have shared, but the students mentioned, well, we've heard a lot about lived experience, but we haven't heard from people with lived experience. And I do think it's just something, that I was going to suggest in my little thing at the end, and, for what it's worth, I just think it would be so cool. Certainly, obviously, we wouldn't require people to say it, but just to mention to people, because I bet, like my primary care doctor once told me half of McLean, Virginia is on Prozac. And I'm just like, I just don't think people, I don't think a lot of young people and parents and their parents who struggle with mental health disorders or don't believe them realize how common it is. So it's more of just like kind of sharing my, the balance that we try to.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Lastly, because we have,
All
they're
right.
telling us we have to go to section 3.
Yeah, so just want to add one other perspective. My name's Nina Rickman, and I work for NAMI, and I'm an adoptive parent to 2 kids from the foster care system. And one thing, as I was contemplating career change many years ago now, I spoke with some advisors, some people that had mentored me, and I said, I'm worried about discrimination in terms of someone hiring me because I'm a single mom and I have 2 special needs kids. And so how do I present myself in a way that people will take a chance on me? And the advice that I was given was, well, share that your kids are adopted, share that. And it really made me think a lot when you brought up lived experience and what lived experience has more value. So parents that have kids that have a trauma history like mine do or have mental health conditions, I think when they are the birth parents, they take on a much heavier burden, whether that's their own feelings around it, their own trauma histories, their own mental illness. And that was something that I was able to compartmentalize, right? I was able to say, I'm an adoptive parent, and people would look at that as they would look at me in a different way because of that perspective. In 2020, I had my own mental health crisis. It was my own experience with having that. And I got a very soft step into what it's like to be involved in the child welfare system because that's what happened for my family. And I was treated as a parent in the child welfare system rather than a foster parent in the child welfare system. And it was shockingly different, the treatment. And so I just wanted to share that perspective with everyone because I think parents, birth parents, that they have a different experience than those of us that are in the foster and adoptive side.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. We've spent a lot of time talking about a lot of these issues and a lot of these biases and a lot of these blind spots over the last year. And I think there's a few points that we've taken away from it, and a lot of them have come up again here today. We want more people to acknowledge that there's more mental illness out there. There's more people that suffer and they're suffering. No one's talking about it. But if we do that, are we undermining the importance of the people that need treatment, right? Because we're making it seem like everybody has it, so it gets sort of marginalized a little bit. It's not that important because I'm depressed as well, right? It's like it loses its level of importance. We've got all of the stuff around the institution and the institutional failures around this, whether that be, the layers, we could talk for hours. In fact, we have talked for hours, haven't we? We've talked for hours about this. But the reason I'm getting to that point is that we've had to make some choices, right? The hardest thing that we do when we are thinking about how to impact something like this or for any of our clients is we have to think about strategically what is the choice we want to make, because you can't do everything. You have to. And good strategy is simply about making a choice and sticking to that choice, and if it doesn't work, making another choice, hopefully getting you to where you want to go. So we're going to talk you through a little bit about some of those choices that we made and where we've landed in that sense. And then Megan is going to talk a little bit and share with you the work that's sort of developing. I won't say it's not finished, it's not complete. We are sharing, we're sort of opening up a little here and sharing with you all because we would love, this is a very vocal and astute crowd. We would like your point of view. Less about like, dislike, right? Because that's very subjective. More, do you think we're hitting on some of these blind spots? And are they powerful enough to break a blind spot? Would be my sort of watch out, right? So, this is the first of our choices, and a lot of debate about this one sentence. But ultimately, we felt that what we could do and have the most impact on was to actually create some outrage over the sheer criminalization of mental illness, right? And that's not to diminish everything else that has been talked about today, because they are as important, but this is something that we felt as a group and as a team that we could have an impact on, and using the tools that we have at our disposal, our creativity and our opportunity. So that's what we set out for. And when we looked at the intersection between what's happening in culture and what's happening sort of at the human level, at the basic level, we have culturally everybody having and willing to have uncomfortable conversations about so many other topics out there that were not 5, 6, 10 years ago being talked about. We're all talking about them. Yet on the other side, whilst it's touching almost every family in America, it's the one thing that no one's talking about. It's no one's really sort of, we get overwhelmed by it, right? We don't want it because it's too, we're too scared of it to really engage. And so it gets very superficialized. What we realized was that ultimately the blind spot we have to overcome is that our response to people with mental illness is actually making us more complicit because it's wrong. When we see a homeless person and we interpret that person as being there for that reason, that response is actually perpetuating that bias, right? It's perpetuating that blind spot. And we need to get people to recognize that their response is wrong. Their response to that individual, that response to that person is wrong first. That's step one. If we don't address that, we can't address anything that comes after that. And creatively, we approach this I remember the conversation that we all had with the creative director when we got to this point, and he went, oh, I could work with this. How do we make mental illness not be a crime? How do we show people that it's not, someone with mental illness is not a criminal? Okay? We're going to talk you through 2 ideas. As I said, these are very early days, and then we'll have a little chat.
Yeah.
For however much time we have left or they let us take.
Yeah, so I'll walk you through the first idea. Both these ideas, they operate off different insights, but we've talked about this. So for the first idea, we're kind of operating off that Shirley principle where people really do assume that there is a system in place to help care for people with mental illness, but what they don't realize is often the number one mental health provider in America is the jail and prison system. So that led to our idea, what if we created an ad campaign for America's number one mental health facility, the prison system? So that's our key image. And the way this will work, at first glance, we really want to subvert people's expectations. So the campaign will be for America's number one mental health facility. It'll look like a real campaign, but when people lean in, when they take a closer look, they'll see the subtext that we're actually advertising America's prison and jail system. What do I mean by that? Or where will it live? It will live in places people expect to come across mental health information. It might be in places where people are seeking out mental health information. It will live in online film. It can live on billboards, in print, in radio, social media, digital. We really want to fully intercept people. And this is what it could look like if it was a billboard. So it takes that language of a PSA. Don't struggle with mental illness alone. Join thousands of others in the US prison system. Yeah, so that's what we want. We really want people to be surprised. We want people to lean in. We want people to pay attention. Imagine you're on Google Maps and you're looking for America's number one mental health facility and you realize it's Rikers Island, right there in New York. Social media, we've talked a lot about, Gen Z, mental health information. There's mental health talk. It's where they're getting information. What if they come across as they're scrolling a video with the prompt, how should patients handle intrusive thoughts? And the person who is responding is a de facto mental health provider, a prison guard. And he's saying, I don't know, like an extra blanket, I'm not sure. So that's our first direction. Idea 2. This really is drafting up that insight that people have been wrongly trained by our culture to see mental illness as a violent threat, which leads them to call 911 for people simply exhibiting symptoms. So let's expose the horrible absurdity of criminalizing any illness. So we call this No Illness is Criminal. He's holding a sign that says diabetic in public. The way that this campaign will work is you want to take iconic criminal imagery and associate it with medical illness. And this imagery is something you wouldn't really be surprised to see associated with mental illness, but when it comes to medical illness, it shocks you, it causes outrage, it seems horrific.
And this campaign, we want to show up where people are regularly criminalizing mental illness. Like Christine showed you all of those news articles that we've seen about that. Like on that page, what if we had an online ad for this? Here's some traditional diabetic in public. We have someone else, a chemo user. We have antibiotic user. And I think the website here is Care, Not Incarceration. A social media example, I think we've all seen people tweeting, people on neighborhood.com, I think, or the app. You know, I moved out of NYC a few years ago, just visited recently, and there are too many crazy people on NY trains. They need police patrolling down there. It's outrageous. That's just a tweet we pulled. And what if we responded, no illness is criminal. There are too many people with cancer on New York trains. They need police patrolling down there. And just see, like, what if we flip the script? What if we use that same language and applied it to medical illness? Again, we have a live stream of someone who has a broken leg being taken into, given the perp walk, being put into a cop car, leaning in what's going on there. So those are our 2 ideas in development. We have some prompts, but I really want to see what you guys are thinking, feeling. I can go back to anything imagery if you want. We have some key questions we're asking ourselves. Do you think people will notice this? What does this work making you feel? Will this work make people think differently about mental illness? Does it feel true to your lived experience, your experience intersecting with people who don't have as much knowledge or appreciation of what it means to be someone with lived experience? What else should we know? I think also we've had a lot of blind spots already. Like, do you think this is going to harm your community? Let's talk about it. I think.
Hi, Nancy McGraw from CSH. And I was going to get up at the last time, talk about my nephew, who is a young adult who has mental illness and is a young black man. And I'm scared for him, right? And so it leads me to the first idea, which the immediate reaction I had was, yes, it's shocking. The second reaction I had is, does it reinforce the scariness for somebody with mental illness? Does it also reinforce the scariness of the general public to say, you know, is that the right place? Is it not the right place? So I just, that was the immediate reaction I had to that first idea.
Yeah. That's cool. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Harry Fisher from Children's Rights. I had 2 thoughts. The first thought was that this is brilliant stuff. This is absolutely great stuff. I wish I could say it with an English accent because it sounds so much better.
It's my life. We tell them that all the time. Don't worry.
The second
it's a fake accent, unfortunately.
He's from New Jersey,
you're
actually.
From Brooklyn, I know.
Yeah.
The third, I want to respond a bit to the third prompt on the chart, and I think it will make people think about mental illness differently. But I'm not sure it will make them think about decriminalization as differently as we want. And my concern is that there's a counter narrative out there. I mean, we're all talking among ourselves and we agree among ourselves and we know that we're right and we are right. But there's another. But not everyone thinks that. And there's another conversation going on out there. And that's the tough on crime conversation. And that district attorneys run for office with a tough on crime campaign. Judges run for office on a tough on crime campaign. Lots of people run for office on a tough on crime campaign. And it can be very powerful, okay? And if their narrative is that criminals need punishment and that to the extent we have more crime, we need more punishment, people can buy into that narrative. So if we're about winning hearts and minds to another viewpoint and winning enough hearts and minds to pull the levers of political, to move the needle in the direction we want to go, I ask, will the messages that we're crafting be sufficient to counter that other narrative, and how do we take that into account, and how do How do we maneuver in that public conversation?
It's a very, very legitimate question, and I'm going to throw it back at you a little bit and ask you this. If you view, and this is really for everybody, if you view this work as the opening line of a narrative, it's the opening line of an argument or a conversation, what are the lines that follow this? Right? Because what you're talking about is a much longer, I mean, you even use the word narrative, right? You're not going to get it across in one social post. You're not going to get it across in a tweet or a TV commercial. But what we can do is we can start a conversation. And my question is, what follows this? What is the right next counterpoint that we are going to have to put up against?
I was just going to ask a question, a clarification sort of question, which is how quickly will, both of these have shock value, I mean, especially the first one.
Mm-hmm.
So how quickly do you follow up with the flip to contextualize what you're saying? And that was just part, like, it's almost like I can't separate my reaction to it without, until I know how quickly.
We have to flip quickly, right? And that's when we say these are in development, that's what we're working out now, is how do we actually turn what are two ideas to trigger into the starting points of something bigger.
And I think it's worth pointing out that either campaign would have an associated website, unbranded website that it would go to, and then that's where people would start to read more into the issue, read more actual contextual information, not just, that this is what grabs the attention, and then the goal is to get people to then read more. Hopefully that will be shared on social media. That will prompt a bigger conversation.
Hi, Rebecca Neustetter, University of Chicago Health Lab. I'm a trained criminologist. I have a PhD in criminology, and I say that by no means because I'm trying to credential myself here, but because I am really legitimately curious as to what the science and the data says about this kind of advertising, because I'm deeply concerned about priming people to make associations that they might not be making otherwise in criminalizing and mental illness. So I'm curious if that's been done or if there's an intention to do that. And I also just want to say that there's a big difference between jails and prisons, and you're conflating the two there. And that's particularly problematic when you're talking about people with mental illnesses who primarily spend lots of time cycling in and out of jails, are also prevalent in prisons, but jails is a real consideration. And you're using prisons where I think you might mean to use jails.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
If I could jump in there, my name's Erin Sweeney. I'm a public defender. I live here in Philadelphia, but I actually practice across the river in Camden. I represent over 300 people at one time, many of whom struggle with a mental illness, whether diagnosed or undiagnosed. Just to her point about conflating jails and prisons, it's actually that jails are the #1 providers of mental health services in the country, and it's specifically 3 jails, New York City's jail system, you mentioned Rikers Island, Los Angeles, and Chicago. This is important because the majority of people who are in our jails in this country have not been convicted of anything.
Right.
Think of Caliph Browder, who was incarcerated for over 2 years on an accusation that he stole a backpack, only to be released, not convicted, and then commit suicide. That is because he did not receive adequate care on Rikers Island. They're also the clients who are most likely to be in on accusations that are minor crimes. So many of my clients who are arrested after a family member calls 911 instead of 988, and because they don't know about 988, not because they want their family member to be arrested, the police show up. Their loved one is in a state of crisis, ends up pushing or spitting on a law enforcement officer, and then is then charged with a felony assault for assaulting a police officer. And those are the clients who end up with short jail sentences, get churned out of the jail, back onto the street, sometimes end up back in crisis, then spit back to the jail system, just bounce back and forth repeatedly. So these are not the people who are most likely to end up in prison, which are obviously your more serious crimes. And frankly, while the care in our prison system, which again, most prisons are run by states and not the federal system, but the feds have a lot more money, and the state prisons have a lot more money than the county jails. So you actually are likely to get better treatment in prison. Not saying that's great, but it's just saying that the jail is really, really bad. And those are our biggest providers. So I think it's important to highlight that in the campaign, but otherwise I think it's a really important campaign, and I'm really grateful for the work y'all are doing.
That's a very big watch out. Thank you. We will make sure that we address the jail, not the prison.
Hi, Deb Steinberg. I'm from the Legal Action Center. My first instinct to both was actually just a little bit cringy, and I'm sorry to be like judgmental, but at least on the prison one, we are trying to like decriminalize any like illness, and you know, we don't want to like elevate that any illness should be criminalized. I know it's like snarky and sarcastic. I support that. That's like my love language, but like maybe we don't want anyone going to prison. Just an idea. And I have represented clients who have actually like kind of sought out situations where they can go back to jail and prison because they can't get care in the community. That's actually real. So just wanted to point out that some of these things just hit me just a little weird because it wasn't the message that we saw in the video you showed earlier, that these are people who live lives with dignity in their community with families and they're thriving. And that was what I hoped for when you were about to introduce the ideas. And you know, the idea that it's not a person with mental illness who's going to show up before the judge. They could be the judge, or it's the person who's in this room advocating for a better world for the people around them. I guess I would urge you and push you to make sure that that is part of the campaign as well.
That's fair. Also, I just want to say, you're not going to hurt our feelings. Like, you can be snarky, you can be sarcastic. Like, that's like our job.
That's our love language.
Yeah, that's our love language. Make fun of us, we don't care. Like, but we really do appreciate it, and it's important for us to understand these sorts of things. And I think also it's important because we haven't really decided yet, like, what are those substantive actions that need to be taken by the general public to decriminalize illness? We are still, as Jonathan said, this is the first step in a longer narrative and very much in development. So I just want to like thank everyone for their feedback.
Yeah, I would also like to say thank you. That's an incredibly important point, is that we're writing this with the layperson in mind and that general public who doesn't experience mental illness to change the way they think about mental illness. But to your point, you know, people with mental illness are also going to see this. And if they're seeing something that's trivializing their experience of having to put themselves in a position to go to jail or prison so that they can get treatment, of course, that's incredibly, you know, offensive to them and their lived experience. And so this is going to reach the general public, but it's going to reach everybody. So we need to keep that in mind.
Hi, on the first idea, you mentioned, and I might be kind of jumping way ahead of the type of feedback that you're looking for, but you mentioned that the media would show up in places where people would expect to see communications about actual treatment services. So I was just curious if you sort of thought through how you're not going to crowd out. If you're jacking up the price of certain keywords that people need to actually stumble upon, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about, it's like, okay, when we like work with a media agency, we actually figure out targeting and things like that. Like, we need to ensure that our media we don't actually want to intercept people who are looking for mental health services and then scare them, or like, you know, so it's going to be a balance. It's just like an example of how the idea would work, but totally we are aware of that, like, you know, dynamic.
Hi, Joni Schwager from the Stone Farm Foundation in Pittsburgh. My question is under the what else should we know? And when you were doing your research, I was just curious to know, my experience has been that the physical health community is not actually I should say they stigmatize the behavioral health community. And I just wondered if you had any partners with them, or you had any thoughts about how we get rid of that.
Working with like medical doctors and
the physical disability advocacy community.
Oh, okay.
In general, do not recognize.
It's a really good watch out. So I think we'll take that. We've not reached out, but I do think that's something we hadn't thought about. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Stormer. I'm a judge in Akron, Ohio, and I've spent the last 25 years of my life trying to decriminalize mental illness because of the number of people I meet in that context. And my comment would be that if you're a diabetic or you take thyroid medication like I do, brain glitches or programming glitches, which is how I describe it to my people, you don't end up coming to the attention of the police. A broken leg is not necessarily going to bring you to the attention of the police. And I think it's trivializing what we see in who is being criminalized. It's people who are being brought, who get the attention of the police somehow. So it's untreated serious mental illness. As we've heard, probably more than half this room is on medication for something. I am also on medication for anxiety. I think many type A people end up being anxious and not sleeping, and we take those meds. But just to compare me to one of my people who is naked because they can't wear clothes right now and it's 20 degrees is not the same as me going, hey, by the way, I've got an anxiety issue. Yeah. And I think you sort of trivialize that moment that brings people to the attention of the police by just saying, hey, go to Rikers if you've got diabetes. I really find that very difficult.
That's fair. That is something we've talked about a lot. Is this trivializing? Is this something? And it's just something that you put an idea out there, you want to see the response, you want to see if it's and how it's reacting. And I think we've talked about, lived experiences. Should we be focusing on those lived experiences or those mental illnesses that are more likely to put you in front of the police? I think that's something we're in discussion about. So
why not take Rihanna, who's come out and said, I've got bipolar disorder and I'm treated very well, and say, would we put her in jail for this? Well, only if she was naked on Main Street, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So to me, you're saying it's not just that you have a mental illness, it's that you have an untreated mental illness. Mm-hmm. And how are we going to deal in the world with the fact that untreated people who maybe can't access, the reason there's so many black people in my system is because the majority have PTSD and substance abuse issues from family of origin problems. Mm-hmm. So, I don't want to say, well, gee, it's just because they have this issue. It's really because they have a conflagration. But if you take high-functioning people who've come out and said, would you arrest Rihanna? Rihanna's never going to get arrested. I don't care what she does, right? And there are other, people who are well-known who have come forward with their own life story. So.
Yep. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Douglas Reed, Black Men Heal. I look at this from a perspective of lived experiences. I'm trying to get so many thoughts, so I'm trying to actually articulate them. One, working in the prison at the county and at the federal level, and actually having to process inmates in and out. And I think about one from the county aspect as far as, someone coming into the system and that particular CO or that administration not being prepared to deal with that particular mental illness. And I think about on the prison side of it, someone has actually been incarcerated for, more than a year. And I worked at one of the largest federal prisons in the United States, that being not having enough psychiatrists, therapists, social workers to even handle that capacity. And we wonder why 60% of people that's been incarcerated say they never received the help. So I look at it in that perspective and knowing, like you said, that it should be a shocking impact. I am a baby boomer, understanding that the effect of social media, and it should be rapid because that's just how Gen Z responds, and that being able to help us. Those are just my thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're close to time, so I think we've got a couple more comments.
I go? Yeah.
Pass it.
Hi, I'm Ken Minkoff from Zia Partners in Arizona. I did a presentation yesterday. And I kind of wanted to piggyback on what Judge Stormer just said because, my reaction to what you were saying was first that I appreciate your willingness to be bold and ironic and challenging, but then I started to get feeling of cringiness because it felt like immediately my reaction, and I'm on your team, was to argue with you. Like you're going too far, like kind of like you're debating something and you're kind of pushing the envelope. So instead of attracting people to the argument, you're creating a sense that somehow we need to argue with you like you're going too far. And so, utilizing the kind of extreme comparison, but then first of all, doing it in kind of a very deliberate, almost like using a scalpel, being very focused and careful about how you frame it, and then immediately contextualizing it within a contrast could be much more effective. And I'm glad Andy just walked in because I've seen Andy do this very well in terms of comparing the experiences of people with cancer to people with mental illness in the health system. And there's a whole, when you're listening to him do it, and probably would be happy to do it for you. But you laugh with him, and then you immediately step in and say, this is something that you can do something about. Another way of doing it, just as an example, is using Judge Stormer's example. If a person with dementia wanders out of their nursing home and is naked and behaving strangely, the likelihood they will be arrested is very small. And that's because we have a way of knowing how to respond. For the people with mental illness who are untreated and on the streets, invisible and scary to people, we don't have that way. And we have to be very careful not to stigmatize the police officers who are stuck and responding to these situations without help, and the people who are walking by feeling like, I wish I knew what to do, but there isn't a system to respond to. And so one of the things, I've just finished with one more thing, but I was one of the co-authors of this recent report last year called Roadmap to the Ideal Behavioral Health Crisis System. And in that report, what we did as a group of writers, Judge Leifman was one of the co-authors and others, Karis, people were asking about yesterday, is that we said this is very daring to talk about an ideal crisis system. How do we contextualize this for people? And what we said was we have to stop thinking that behavioral health crisis services are a nice luxury that we will do if we happen to have some extra money to do it with. That we have to think of those services as an essential community service, like we think about fire and public safety and emergency medical systems. And that kind of, it's sort of nuanced, but it's bold. But I'm encouraging you to take your willingness to push the envelope, but then get really laser focused about how you balance messages, one right next to another, so that anybody in the audience will feel like they want to be on your side on this message.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we want to take one more? I know we're pretty much out of time, but I know you're waiting there.
Good morning, Mark Anthony Clayton Johnson, Executive Director of Dignity and Power Now. So we are in Los Angeles and are on the other side of an 8-year campaign that resulted in LA County stopping, not going forward with building a $3.5 billion mental health jail. And that work was really incredible, really led by folks who've been incarcerated, led by organizers, led by folks who have mental health disabilities. We are in a phase where we've designed with the county and gotten approved a roadmap to build other things, particularly care infrastructure. And to this question around what else should we know, one of the things I've been concerned about, particularly as my role of working with clinicians and bringing them into these fights, is the assumption that building care infrastructure is non-carceral. And one of the things we've seen, and we're working with clinicians now who oftentimes feel pressured to defer to law enforcement in the very spaces where folks are struggling to get care, emergency rooms and those type of things. And so I offer that to say I think there's really important work to do around decriminalizing mental health. But what often happens is we focus on the most obvious carceral structures and infrastructure. What we don't think about is the ways in which interactions, policies are drafted in emergency rooms, things like that actually create, that are part of that pathway, right? And so it's something that we're concerned about as we're building this out. And I'm very eager to be in conversation with folks around how do we build care infrastructure and build care culture and build policies and places that actually have less deference to law enforcement to do just basic things like protecting patient privacy rights, right? Like protecting the physical health and safety of patients who come into those rooms. So yeah, I think I just offer that to say that there's a on the other side of the decriminalizing and building of care, there are some dangers in that space that we have to address.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. We're out of time. We actually thought coming into this that you may all not want to talk about this stuff, but we were wrong about that, so thank you. Really appreciate it. This is very helpful for us as we continue down this road and continue to refine our thinking and hearing from all of your lived experiences, your expertise. It's the best focus group that we can get. So thank you.
Thank you.